Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Today, I interviewed Greg Jarrell, a founder of QC Family Tree, which is a community of hospitality in Charlotte, North Carolina. In addition to Greg's work in Charlotte, Greg is also a musician and the author of the book, A Riff of Love, Notes on Community and Belonging. Surprising teachers, tragic losses, unexpected gifts. Every neighborhood has stories and ways of singing the stories of their place. Start digging in and you find all sorts of music. In a neighborhood skilled in improvisation like Enderly Park, you also discover new ways to sing those songs and a choir of new kinfolk to sing them with. Since 2005, author and saxophonist Greg Jarrell has been learning the songs of Enderly Park, his Charlotte neighborhood. A Riff of Love explores the riffs and melodies that comprise the life of the neighborhood and of QC Family Tree, the hospitality house where he lives. Though neighbors there face significant economic and political barriers, they still thrive. Funny, heartbreaking, and challenging in equal measure, these stories and essays about life in Enderly Park will surely inspire new improvisations towards community and neighbor love for everyone who reads them. Good morning, Greg. Welcome to the Means of Grace podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Brian. Glad to be with you.
Sure. We're going to dive right in. And you work with a ministry called QC Family Tree. I want you to tell us a little bit about that and maybe how that started and just anything else that it's important for our folks to hear.
Sure. So QC Family Tree, QC for Queen City. We are located in the West Charlotte neighborhood of Enderly Park. We do cultural organizing aimed at building the common good. And so that means for all of our staff working at sort of two distinct but overlapping goals. For one, working to build power within Black communities, particularly within the Black community where we are located. In West Charlotte and specifically in the Enderly Park neighborhood, but also working to break the bonds of white supremacy, to dismantle, disrupt white supremacy, particularly within the congregations and the organizations that we work with. And so we use cultural programs to get at that, including visual art, music, and history, and storytelling as well. So we use those kind of art forms to get at that work of building power within Black communities and of disrupting and dismantling white supremacy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. Could you share a little bit about what some of your programs or your ministries? I know you work with young people in your neighborhood, and maybe if you could tell us a little bit about Enderly Park itself, what that's like for those that aren't Charlotte-based people.
Yeah. So QC Family Tree started 16 years ago in 2005. My wife, Helms, and me, and a group of seminarian friends had been in school at the Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond. We moved here as part of this community we sort of fashion ourselves like a Catholic worker kind of community. So the practices of hospitality and resistance within this space. And from over the course of those 16 years, there have been lots of changes, lots of ways that we've grown into our role and the place that we have in the struggle for justice. And so among those changes, now we have a couple of important programs. So for one, we are a small-scale affordable housing provider. We have a small portfolio, I guess is a word you could use, of 5 apartments, 2 single-family houses that we rent at far below the market rates to try to be a part of the solution for helping families to stay stable and to have safe places for for long-term families to live. So those are not transitional spaces; they're long-term places for people to live and hopefully to thrive and to flourish. We are working on a plan about how to transition those from rental to home ownership through like a land trust kind of mechanism. So we have that housing provider role, as well as working on systemic issues around housing. So we have a community organizer on staff who is working to build within the movement for better affordable housing within Charlotte, working to build this specific neighborhood's power to advocate for the needs of this neighborhood and to have that grow from within the community rather than, from any nonprofit organization or from the city telling us what to do, having that movement grow from within.
Yeah.
We also have a number of cultural programs. Some of those are like one-time events. I lead a couple of tours, one about neighborhood development within the city of Charlotte and sort of framing it historically and theologically. The other, walking the city as a labyrinth. And so sort of some movement inward, movement outward, sort of joining history, spirituality, and sort of the public art that's available within the city as a way of helping folks to interpret the streetscape. My wife Helms is a profoundly good visual artist. Our staff member Hannah Hassan is a storyteller who's often putting together story programs. And so we have these several different means of engaging with folks programmatically as well.
Yeah. So a couple of things to note that, QC Family Tree is not a place that you go to, but necessarily it's a place that you live and you have chosen to live as your family. The Enderly Park neighborhood and affordable housing in the city of Charlotte in general is a huge issue and barrier for folks. And yet I know that area is gentrifying quickly because of the development on the west side of Charlotte. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges, maybe how things have changed in the community over the years and your work in advocacy for affordable housing in the neighborhood.
16 years ago, there were no other white people moving to Enderly Park. And when we told some family in this area that we were moving over here, they strongly discouraged us moving to West Charlotte generally. We didn't know how to interpret that clearly, except that we knew that, for one, as part of sort of the Catholic worker movement, not officially, but certainly in heart, that being among the poor and having the poor as our teachers, as people who could disciple us into the way of Jesus, was really essential for us. And so we wanted to live and to work in the same community among the poor, and often sharing our houses, sharing our table with the poor. So that was one important thing. But we have learned historically that West Charlotte was what a former mayor of ours, Harvey Gantt, called the catchment basin for urban renewal. And so the story of this neighborhood turns out to be really important and sort of illustrative of social movement within the city generally and within religious communities specifically. So 50 years ago, this was a white neighborhood. It was built beginning in 1924 or so as a white neighborhood with deed restrictions that said only persons of the Caucasian race or the white race should live in, own, occupy, or otherwise dwell in these properties where we currently live. Those deed restrictions were invalidated, made illegal made unenforceable by the Supreme Court 30 or so years after that. But the language is still there. But then what happened beginning in the mid 60s was the razing of a number of black neighborhoods, razing, R-A-Z-I-N-G, the destruction of a number of black neighborhoods in and around downtown Charlotte, and the forced movement of neighbors from there primarily to West Charlotte neighborhoods. And so the neighborhoods around us have historically been both black and white neighborhoods, separate but often conjoined right next to one another. And in the 1960s, there began a 15 or 20 year period of white flight where these became exclusively black neighborhoods. And then the problems associated with the inner city, so-called, developed here. Those problems weren't problems with the neighbors. They were problems with the systems. So those were the problems of over-policing, of mass incarceration, of underfunding of our basic public infrastructure and of our school systems, for instance. And so West Charlotte sort of became, the place that folks didn't move unless they had to, unless they didn't have any other choice. In a lot of cases. So that has changed recently. The rapid reinvestment after a 50-year period of disinvestment, it has now become very profitable for investors in particular to buy property on this side of town. So consequently, we have in our neighborhood, some neighborhoods, this started a few years ago. Here it's in full swing now. Our neighborhood has seen housing prices roughly triple over the past 5 years. Wow. So you used to not be able to buy a house for less than or for more than $100,000. That was kind of an extreme price. Now the house 2 doors down from us has just been flipped and is on the market for $415,000. Wow. And so we've seen this extreme increase that is reflected in both the rents and in the sale prices now within this neighborhood. And that's the next stage of this kind of serial displacement. The same families in some cases who were displaced by urban renewal a couple of generations later are now being displaced by gentrification, if you want to call it that, in our neighborhood.
Yeah, I moved to Charlotte 7 years ago, and I'm struck by how fast that transition is happening. I was just through there not too long ago, and seltzeries are opening, and various types of shared office space, and it's just and that's bumping up right against where you guys have been living and breathing for the past.
We have to tell the people what in the world a seltzery is.
Right? Yeah, right.
So they make alcoholic sparkling water, and that's right on the edge of our neighborhood now. Yeah, it's the hip thing. It's packed all the time, and it's right across the street from the dog bar.
Right. Yeah, I saw that.
Dogs to drink beer. Right. So we've gone from the catchment basin for urban renewal in this long period of disinvestment to like peak white people is right on the edge of the neighborhood now.
One of the things I want to talk about with you is you've written a book about your experiences with QC Family Tree and in the neighborhood called Riff of Love. And our conference is going to be starting on April 21st, hosting a virtual book club with your book featured. And we're going to have kind of a 4-week study of your book and have conversation. And that'll happen on Wednesday, starting April 21st, and we'll have a session at 10 a.m. and a session at 7 p.m. So we'll put the sign up link in the show notes. But one of the things that we'll do is I hope we'll engage with you in at least one of those sessions about your book. But your book's titled Riff of Love: Notes on Community and Belonging. So why Riff of Love? And tell the listeners a little bit about your book. Give us some overview and maybe share some of your other talents as well.
Yeah, sure. So you'll find in the book sort of the theme that tries to hold everything together is around music. So I am a musician. Play. That's kind of one of the ways that I keep the lights on around here. So I play saxophone in a number of jazz and pop groups around Charlotte. And one of in sort of an integrative kind of way, having been trained in that discipline or in that tradition. One of the ways I've come to see the world in this neighborhood in particular is that, Black American music developed around improvisation. And in the same way that music developed around improvisation, so do the lives of my neighbors often move around improvisation. From a very small amount of resources, people figure out how to create something beautiful. And so there is kind of this mystery that I want to lift up and to recognize, to honor, that most folks here don't have everything they need. And yet there's this deep network of solidarity that's really this remarkable act of beauty that kind of dances across our sidewalks and in and out of people's houses on a daily basis, where in the midst of the ongoing oppressions of white supremacy, in the midst of the way that white supremacy lands on the bodies and the spirits of my neighbors, through not having enough food, through not having enough money, through not having equal access to good schools, which is one of the ongoing struggles here in West Charlotte. Despite all that, people care for one another. Nobody starves. People do these, create these remarkable works of beauty and of community. And I've been invited into that. So the book is really my story of, not just learning to see things through this lens of improvisation, but having been invited into a tradition, both musically and in the neighborhood, that creates room for people to improvise and to offer their gifts and to create these communities of belonging, where the world hasn't really learned to see the beauty of that yet. I've been able to, and so want to try to tell some of that story.
I'd like to read just the very first part of your book, in the prologue. You say this: right now I'm doing exactly what good white people teach good white boys like me not to do. I'm walking alone in what my peers would classify as one of the worst neighborhoods in Charlotte. It is late, nearing midnight. I do not exactly know when I'll return, nor did I leave information on my whereabouts. You're open about your whiteness and moving into a predominant Black community. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how that's played out over the years, maybe what you were thinking versus what you've learned over the years.
Yeah. So I think this is really crucial for us for people like me who have been racialized as white, to take responsibility for the story that we've been given. We didn't really choose it, but it is our story, and we have to take some responsibility for it. And so one of the profound learnings that my neighbors have had the grace to offer to me is just to begin to recognize and to name the racial context that everything has. So at Southeast Raleigh Table, which is affiliated with Edenton Street United Methodist in Raleigh, one of their kind of guiding principles that their pastor, Lisa Yaboa, has is that race is always on the table. And that's just the case in the United States. There's no way around it. Race is always on the table.
Yeah.
And so as people racialized as white, we've not been taught how to think critically about race and about how to analyze the way that it's informing everything that we do, all the interactions that we have. And so one of my goals within the book was to begin naming that for myself, in the ways that I had learned it, as a way of trying to encourage other white Christians in particular to name the ways that race was always on the table, and how sometimes that has. So I've tried to be honest in telling stories on myself as well. The ways that whiteness has formed us into, roles within the culture that don't really belong to us. the ways that it has allowed us, for instance, in that story, to just think that we can belong anywhere. And if we're going to belong, then it has to be at the initiation and at the welcome of other people. That idea that I should have been or could have been walking around as though I was just okay anywhere, sort of a product of the doctrine of discovery. The idea that white folks just kind of own stuff. That's the way it is. And so through the book, I've tried to tell stories on myself, say, hey, this is how this is operating in me, and it's operating in all of us, and it's always on the table, and we've got to take responsibility for that so that we can undo the damage that is done to our souls, the damage that is done to our neighbors.
Having sat with you a few times and been on the tour around Charlotte that you offer for folks, and learning about, some of the history of Charlotte, not only the known history, but the kind of unwritten history. One of the things that's really stuck with me is you talk about the historical marker, which is just up the street from QC Family Tree. And you talk about kind of the importance of knowing those written and unwritten histories in order that we might own those and also be part of a healing or a solution, or even just an awareness of.
Yeah, certainly healing or dismantling begins with awareness and begins with bringing what's implicit and making it explicit. So the short story, I'll try to keep it brief, so a couple of years ago, I became just intensely aware of these two contrasting stories on our corner. So we have a small campus, a couple of houses that we operate in the house where I live, at the corner of Tuckasegee Road and Parkway Avenue in West Charlotte. And in 2012, I believe it was, 2012, we had a murder that took place on that corner of a young person that we deeply loved, and that everyone in the neighborhood deeply loved. He was one of the kind of popular kids that was always around and was just deeply loved. He was only 13 years old. And what happened in the immediate aftermath of his death was that neighbors constructed an altar as a way of remembering him. The altar was filled with all these mementos and markers, his name, an old bike that he had, candles, stuffed animals, flowers, some art that people produced. So there was an altar there. And about a year or so later, a historical marker went up directly across the street. So same corner, just one side of Tuckasegee versus the other. And that marker was for a man named Sid Alexander, whose story was completely unknown within this neighborhood, and relatively unknown around the state. SB Alexander. So I took note of sort of the distinction, these two altars in some ways of remembering. And eventually I just kind of went into the stacks to try to figure out, who is this guy? So the short story is that Sid Alexander grew up in as a white man in a large slaveholding family in Charlotte. Alexander is an important name here historically. Grew up in a slaveholding family, went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which was an elite institution in that day, still is to a certain extent. And while he was there, signed up to join the Confederate Army, rose to the rank of captain, which is a somewhat high rank, and became a farmer scholar, sort of a lost position within our culture today, but sort of the standard. Thomas Jefferson is, kind of the ideal, the farmer scholar. So Alexander ran for political office as a Democrat, which in his day was the party of white supremacy. There's a long history if you've been involved with the Poor People's Campaign and the Moral Mondays movement, you've heard Dr. Barber talk about the fusion movement that begins in North Carolina, the election of 1894. The short story of Sid Alexander is that he had the opportunity to join the fusion movement. The Farmers Alliance that he was the head of was a significant part of multiracial organizing between what was then called the Colored Farmers Alliance and the Farmers Alliance that helped to bring about the fusion movement. Sid Alexander rejected that movement and instead chose to run for office as a Democrat as part of the white supremacy campaigns that began taking place, particularly in the election of 1898. So as a reaction to the fusion movement, when the white supremacists threw a parade in downtown Charlotte prior to the election of 1900 and the beginnings of Jim Crow being established here, they invited Sid Alexander to be one of the guests of honor seated at the front of the parade. And so this was a man who had a choice to break with whiteness, to break with racial hegemony, and to organize together with Black people, and who could choose sort of his own status as an economic elite and his status as a white man, and chose that status. So we have these two altars on either side of Tuckasegee that, in my way of thinking, really represent this remarkable choice that's still offered to us today if we know how to interpret that history, if we know how to interpret the space, right, to interpret the street grid in the way that it's offering us an opportunity to choose. So that's the brief story, and I've really come to see that learning those stories, not letting them continue to be implicit, but making them explicit, and saying, the choice that's offered to us today to break with racial hegemony, to break with white supremacy, has been offered to us and to our people over and over throughout history. Sid Alexander made the wrong choice. And only by reckoning with that story and then learning our way into a different kind of story can we make a break with that racial hegemony.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I've learned, and I can't pass by a historical marker now without thinking, I wonder what impact has happened on this community because of that.
Yeah. I think that's important. So a historical marker is not really an altar. And, I should probably say it's sort of pushing on the meaning of those things.
Sure.
I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm grateful for that marker because that the marker is there because this neighborhood was his land to the extent that anybody can own land. This neighborhood was his farm, and then became parceled into a neighborhood. All that is to say, without that marker, I wouldn't know who Sid Alexander is, right? So those things are often an invitation to say, hey, there's a story here that you haven't considered yet. It might be time to dig into it a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's important for our listeners that represent maybe different churches throughout Western North Carolina. There's a history of every place. There's a history of your church on every corner. Maybe different than the Enderly Park corner there.
Yeah, sure.
But I think it's as a society, as a church, we're wrestling with white supremacy and connecting with a history and reckoning with our histories is the first step along the path.
Yeah, that's right. So oftentimes you try to talk to people about history and their eyes kind of glaze over, right? But we're talking about stories. We're talking about the stories that make up the legacies that we've inherited, and the stories that we're creating are all informed by the stories from the past. That's the only way we have to think about who we are now.
Yeah, and that this storytelling that you're talking about with this, and with QC family tree it's very biblical. So it seems very, very natural. And so I'd love for you to share maybe a story of something that you love about your neighborhood, of something that has of goodness, of anything that you'd like to share about in a story.
So this one woman who lives close by has just been I think a really remarkable neighbor. Grew up in this neighborhood on the west side. I grew up as part of a family displaced by urban renewal, and continues to engage with some personal struggle herself, but also is just a key activator within the neighborhood. So she's an amazing organizer. When there's a movement that needs to be pushed forward in front of people, she is absolutely trustworthy within the community, and folks listen to her. She tells you what to do, then you just say yes. That's how you respond.
Yeah.
And so there is there's just this sense that she wrestles on the daily with the ways that a culture that was not designed for her flourishing that she has to fight back against that. And also, she just kind of builds this network of belonging, the way that she's taken in. We've had a couple of untimely deaths recently, one by an act of violence, one by what are seemingly natural causes, that where a young man under 30 suffered cardiac arrest. And it's cardiac arrest for people under 30. It doesn't seem natural. I think it's the result of racial domination and the result of white supremacy being foisted upon the bodies of young Black men. And what this woman across the street has been able to do in response to that has really built community out of tragedy. It's built this sense of belonging in a way that both offers nurture and healing, but also that is fiercely resisting the kinds of forces that would take our young people and keep them in bondage to this story of race that is fundamentally a lie.
I'm sensing, a couple of things for our listeners and those in the church, in our conferences. Knowing your history is really important, and recognizing the assets in the community, recognizing the places and the spaces where God is always already at work. I think the church sometimes looks at an underserved neighborhood and they think, this is what I'm going to go and do and fix, without doing the hard work of the history lessons, the learning of the key people in the community, the knowing the stories. And I think for impact, both in a weird church kind of way, but also personal impact, we need to do the hard work of learning.
Those two streams of history and of working from an asset-based perspective, those things are deeply tied together. One of the questions in our mission work that we've been taught to ask is to look for the needs, right? Where are the neediest people?
Yeah.
And that's where we're told to go. And the question is always, from a position of privilege, how can I serve? And we like to frame it in terms of serving, because that helps us to flatten the power differential that we're being invited to see. But if we talk about serving, then we can pretend like we can flip that power differential somehow. But if instead we just bring a different question to the context, then it can make all the difference. So rather than saying, where are the neediest people and how can we go and serve them? The question is more like, what's the story of the community that is struggling the most? And how are we wrapped up in that story?
Yeah.
So I'm currently at work on a project about white churches and urban renewal. And one of the things I'm trying to invite a number of churches in town to ask is just that sort of question. What's the story of the way that race and neighborhood development has been influenced by, has been directed by the theology and the political theology of white churches? What did we do, and why did we do it, and how does that inform the way that we need to act in ministry now? So the basic answer to the question is what did we do is that we kept silent in our churches, but we put our people on the political committees that made these things, that made the raising of Black neighborhoods happen. That's the short answer. And once you begin to unpack that we were silent, that not only were we silent, it wasn't that we didn't even see that there was an issue with the taking of people's neighborhoods, with the destruction of Black churches. So once we can begin to see that we haven't even begun to see this, we can begin to see how our stories are tangled up in this, right? And so if you show up in my neighborhood, for instance, now, asking that question, how are our stories tangled together? And that offers a very different trajectory of the type of work that we need to do back in our white congregations. So that work is about becoming racially conscious, of understanding how race has always been on the table and always will be on the table. There are questions about repairing the damages that we've done by our silence, by our participation, even when we didn't know what we were participating in. We're still responsible for that. And questions about how we continue to perpetrate that through our mission engagement, through the ways that we frame how we think about mission, through our investments, through the way that we think about land and real estate. So white churches are often at the forefront of gentrification. I know a whole bunch of good white pastors. I could rightly probably be accused of being one of them, who have all these great intentions for our West Charlotte neighborhoods. And what ultimately happens when they move over here is that just like the old story of the doctrine of discovery, sort of the way that African elders framed this was that when the white man showed up, we had the land and they had the Bible. And after he prayed, we opened our eyes and we had the Bible and they had the land, right? That same thing is happening still. Yeah. And white churches are still leading the charge on that, unrecognized. And so we have to do the homework to say, we've got to figure out how we're tangled up in this story, and we've got to stop it so that we can repair the damages, both to our Black neighbors, to other neighbors of color, but also the damages it's doing to our souls.
I always, when I'm with you, I learn something and have something to think about, have something to encourage others to think about. So would you like to share any more about your book, kind of the release date or anything specifically about your new project? Yeah,
so there's still a long ways to go. It'll be a while before we get anything out there.
Okay.
But I am excited about this. We've not thought about our relationships to land. With the sort of blip on the radar being people talking a bit more about climate change, but we've not thought about land and property and the way that those values have reinforced and been reinforced by the doctrine of discovery and how all that's bound up with race. So, I think this is important. And these tours, I would invite your listeners, if you want to make a trip to Charlotte or bring a group. I think that putting ourselves into those spaces and exploring these stories can really help us to change our imagination for what ministry looks like in our time.
Yeah. So more to come, I guess, on your book coming up, but maybe it'd be a good time for you to share how people can connect to you or contact you if they desire to learn more about the tours.
Sure. So qcfamilytree.org is the organization's website. I have a personal website, gregjarrell.com. So you can contact me through either of those things. I will tell you, I'm not great about updating websites on the regular. So might see some out of date stuff. So we would certainly welcome for you to come and engage with one of those tours. Spend a little time reflecting on how that work might make a difference. I also, with the band, one of the bands that I help to lead, I've got some material up on the website, or going up on the website soon, about ways that we're trying to incorporate this through song and through music with some really, really talented musicians. And so we're trying to take that program out from Charlotte as well. So that might be another potential connection, some musical connections and work within congregations in their own places.
Okay, great. And is there any way that if our listeners want to support you or support the work of QC Family Tree, anything that you're working on that they could help with? Sure.
So you can donate to the work of QC Family Tree generally at qcfamilytree.org. There's an easy link there. In particular, one of those apartments that we rent, everything's a century old here, and so that means ongoing updates. We've reached a point where the next thing on the list is to gut a kitchen, and the kitchen is the site of hospitality, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's the place where this one family in particular has nurtured this community for 20 years now that they've lived here. And so this kitchen, it's time, and it's going to cost $30,000 plus to do that. So if you want to send enough to cover a faucet or a sink or a refrigerator, or a new cabinet or something like that, we'd put it to work in a hurry.
Yeah. Also, I know you take Workteams from time to time as well.
Yeah, occasionally we do. We're a little hesitant about that. I think it reinforces some of our worst assumptions, and so we do that in the context of a relationship where we've been able to work together on the story of how our stories are all knit together, where we ask anybody to pick up a hammer because we don't want to reinforce any of that bad.
Yeah, sure. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your time and the work that you're doing, especially the enlightenment that you're providing for folks like me to think about and to challenge myself and in our churches.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Brian. I appreciate the invitation. This has been great, and I look forward to catching up with some of the listeners.
Thanks for listening. And if you'd like to engage with Greg further, we invite you to sign up and register for our virtual book club starting on April 21st. It'll run for 4 weeks, and it'll be a time to engage in Riff of Love, and also you'll have the opportunity to talk with Greg personally on one of our Zoom calls. Check out the show notes to register.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.